The chapel's doors groaned open under the weight of fate, their echoing creak swallowed by the hush of stained-glass whispers and centuries of unshed tears. The scent of myrrh and melting wax hung heavy in the air, like sorrow draped in incense. Grandmother Eleanor Worthington stepped inside, her black mourning gown flowing like spilled ink across the alabaster floor. Each step was a sentence, each heel a judgment passed. Beside her shuffled Arabella, her breath shallow, her eyes wide with dread. The pale satin of her dress clung to her full figure, made damp from tears and the oppressive heat of her corset. The fabric, once chosen to flatter, now betrayed her, tight at the seams, clinging where it should have floated. She looked like a child forced into a wedding she never chose, her trembling hands clasped before her as if in supplication. At the altar, Father Benedict stood like a monument to unyielding grace. His eyes, obscured by deep sockets, flicked between the elder and the girl. He made no protest, no plea. Only a single nod, as though this were a matter already consigned to holy will. Grandmother Eleanor's voice broke the stillness. "This is the only way." It was not cruel. That might have implied emotion. It was cold, steel-polished and dry as dust in a crypt. Her hand, gloved in black lace, reached for Arabella's wrist and placed it into the priest's calloused grip. The girl flinched at the touch. Murmurs rippled from the congregation, faceless shapes behind pews, bathed in colored light from the stained glass. Their silence was heavy with judgment, their expressions masked by reverence or disdain. Arabella dared not look at them. Her eyes fixed on the altar's cross, wood darkened by time and incense, where salvation was promised, but not to her. Arabella's heart thundered in her chest. This altar was meant for holy unions, for promises sealed in love, not this cold transference of custody masquerading as virtue. Her breath hitched. This was no sanctuary. It was a cage gilded in sacred rites. The priest raised a hand to the cross. "The Lord receives all who are lost," he intoned. Arabella could not decide if it was a blessing or a pronouncement of exile. Then, without a backward glance, Eleanor turned. Her black veil fluttered like a bird's broken wing, catching a gust from the door. For a fleeting moment, the veil lifted, and Arabella glimpsed her grandmother's face. It was not cruel. It was worse, resolute. A face carved from pride, unmoved by pleading. Arabella's knees gave out. She crumpled to the cold stone floor, tears breaking past the dam of her silence. Her sobs echoed, swallowed by the chapel's unforgiving stone. Grandmother Eleanor kept walking, footsteps fading, the door closing behind her with a solemn finality. The silence that followed was not peaceful. It was the kind that mourned what could never be retrieved. Arabella, abandoned beneath holy icons, did not know what was worse, the abandonment, or the lie that it was for her salvation. The chapel was quiet, save for the muted creaks of old wood and the distant caw of crows outside. Arabella sat on the edge of a pew, her knees drawn to her chest, staring at the flickering candle flames that threw shifting shadows across the stone walls. She hadn't spoken in hours. Maybe longer. Time, inside these walls, was measured not by clocks, but by the movement of light across stained glass. She'd been given a room, if it could be called that. A narrow cell behind the sacristy, with a hard cot, a basin, and a crucifix above the door that seemed to judge her every breath. The air was cold and dry, with no trace of lavender or linen or the comfort of home. It smelled of dust, mildew, and old sorrow. A convent might have welcomed her. But this chapel had taken her. Father Benedict moved like a man made of smoke, quiet, ever-present. He had not spoken to her since the handover. Not beyond the barest necessities. That morning, he placed a bowl of watery porridge before her on the wooden table near the sanctuary. Arabella ate slowly, the spoon clinking softly with each bite. It tasted of nothing. Like obligation. "You will assist with cleaning the altar tomorrow," he said, finally. His voice was low, like the groaning of a tree in winter. "And prepare hymnals for Sunday Mass." Arabella didn't reply. What words could she offer? "Thank you." "Please no." Her tongue felt thick with unshed tears and swallowed screams. She returned to her corner near the confessional, where she'd been told she could sit. She found herself listening to the wind that seeped through the chapel stones, at times like whispering voices, at others like distant weeping. She watched dust motes float through shafts of holy light, drifting aimless like her. The pew beneath her creaked as she shifted. Even the wood, it seemed, had a voice. Her thoughts drifted to her grandmother. Had she gone straight back to her estate in the hills? Was she already sipping tea with clergy, praising herself for her mercy? Did she feel satisfaction? Or worse, relief? A figure entered from the nave, a woman in modest robes with auburn hair pinned tightly back. Her steps were purposeful, her expression unreadable. She offered Arabella a small cloth-wrapped bundle and a thin smile. "Bread. And water. You'll need it after evening prayers," the woman said. "I'm Sister Miriam." Arabella nodded. Her throat tightened around the words she didn't speak. That night, Arabella lay awake, staring at the cracked ceiling above her cot. Her fingers curled tightly around her shawl, pulled up to her chin like armor. The silence in the chapel was not empty. It was dense. It spoke in the language of guilt, of judgment, of ancient oaths whispered in candlelight. She closed her eyes and tried to imagine herself anywhere else, under the stars, near a river, in a home where love did not come with terms. But even her dreams betrayed her, filled only with stone, shadow, and her grandmother's retreating veil. Father Benedict watched from the corner of the sanctuary, half shrouded in candlelight, as Arabella quietly dusted the altar steps with a frayed cloth. Her movements were slow, uncertain. She paused often, her breath catching when her knee ached or her corset pinched too sharply. Her sleeves were rolled back, revealing forearms that bore the bruises of a life she'd never trained for: manual labor, silence, obedience. It was not pity that Priest felt as he watched her struggle. It was something heavier. He turned from the sight and moved to the vestry, where ancient ledgers waited to be annotated. But his thoughts did not follow. They remained with the girl, the child really, who had been cast upon him like an unwanted relic. She had been given to God as though she were a tithe, or a curse. He had seen cruelty before. In confessions. In war. In the faces of young men who came home broken. But the kind done in righteousness, that was the worst. Eleanor Worthington's voice still echoed in his ears: "Take her. Mold her. Use the church to tame her." Tame. As though Arabella were an animal to be broken. And yet, he had agreed. In the nave, Arabella was finishing her task. She straightened slowly, a grimace flickering across her face as her spine cracked. Her hair was damp from sweat, curls clinging to her flushed cheeks. When she noticed the priest watching her from the side of the archway, she flinched, then looked down, as if caught stealing. "You missed the north rail," he said softly, gesturing to a section of the altar. She nodded, returning with trembling hands to correct her mistake. Silence settled between them once more, thick as incense. "Do you know why you are here, child?" he asked suddenly. She hesitated. "Because I failed," she whispered. His brow furrowed. "Failed?" "My grandmother said," her voice trailed off, but the rest came without sound, too large. Too soft. Too shameful to marry. A burden to the family name. Father Benedict felt that old bitterness again. Holy orders had not rid him of it. "You are not here because you failed," he said finally. "You are here because she could not see who you are." Arabella blinked, caught between skepticism and hope. "I cannot promise comfort," he continued, softer now. "But I will not strike you down for existing." The words were not healing. But they were the first thread of something that might become a bridge. That night, as Arabella lay curled on the hard cot in her cell, she thought of his words. Not because they were kind, but because they hadn't blamed her. She had not known what mercy might look like. It turned out, sometimes it looked like a weary priest speaking softly in an empty church. Outside, the wind howled through the cracks in the stone. But inside, something small stirred, like a candle fighting the dark. The morning light crept across the chapel floor like a cautious visitor, filtering through stained glass and breaking into brilliant fragments across the worn pews. Arabella moved silently with her broom and bucket, her every motion a quiet act of submission. The stone beneath her feet was cold and uneven. Her fingers, once accustomed only to embroidery and tea service, now bore calluses. Her back ached. Her corset pinched. But her silence endured. Each morning began the same: prayers before sunrise, chores under the eye of Sister Miriam, and a single quiet meal before returning to the unspoken duty of invisibility. But Arabella had started to see something she hadn't noticed before. It was in the cracks, literal and spiritual. The chapel was beautiful, but old. The gilding along the pulpit had chipped in places. The statue of Saint Catherine had a broken finger, carefully reglued. The crucifix above the altar tilted slightly, no longer perfectly straight. And in the eyes of the faithful, when they came on Sundays, draped in lace and reverence, she saw something else broken. Guilt. Fear. Weariness. Not peace. Not holiness. It had taken only a few weeks for her to understand that these rituals, these hymns, were armor, not always truth. She swept carefully beneath the altar table, her hands steady now. Father Benedict had barely spoken to her this morning, but she felt his gaze occasionally flick to her as he arranged books and lit candles in preparation for Mass. "You've grown stronger," Sister Miriam had remarked earlier, after watching Arabella lift a heavy basin of water without complaint. Stronger. The word echoed in her chest. It felt dangerous, almost rebellious. Was it wrong to feel pride in this place? She paused, resting her hand against the wooden edge of the altar, running her fingers along the grain. Her heartbeat was steady now. No longer panicked. No longer fluttering like a trapped bird. The silence no longer felt as suffocating as it once had. In its own way, it had become something else, a shield. But the shadows remained. She still heard her grandmother's voice at night, whispering recriminations. Gluttonous. Embarrassment. A waste of breeding. And when she looked in the mirror, small, cracked, hung above the basin, she still sometimes recoiled from the reflection. Not because she was ugly, but because that face still looked so lost. The chapel bell rang out, summoning the morning into fullness. Arabella set aside her tools and moved to the back, taking her usual place beside the font. The sanctuary filled slowly with light and echoing steps. Worshippers arrived, heads bowed, lips pursed, voices raised in sacred chorus. But Arabella sang no hymns. She watched them instead. Studied their shadows as they crossed the nave. Every one of them had come seeking something. Forgiveness. Direction. Peace. Arabella didn't yet know what she sought. But she knew this much: she no longer sought escape. She was searching for herself now. And that, however quietly, was the beginning of defiance. It was just after Vespers when Arabella slipped away. The chapel's stone walls were cooling with the onset of dusk, and the long shadows of candlelight wavered across holy images. Father Benedict had retired to his study, and Sister Miriam was still in the kitchen, humming softly as she scrubbed the supper pots. It was the only time of day Arabella found herself truly alone. Her soft slippers made no sound against the stone corridor. She passed the carved wood doors of the confessional, the flickering candelabras, the great bell rope, silent for now. Her hands trembled as she reached the heavy wooden door that led to the outer courtyard. She hadn't stood beyond it since the day her grandmother abandoned her here. She hesitated. Then pushed. The hinges groaned faintly, as though protesting the breach. Outside, the air hit her like a memory. The scent of early autumn, the iron of dry leaves, the damp of earth, rushed into her lungs. The courtyard was overgrown, its hedges untended, vines snaking over broken statuary and cracked benches. But to Arabella, it was wild beauty. Freedom in disrepair. She moved slowly toward the stone basin at the center. It had once held holy water, she imagined, but now it was filled with leaves, moss, and rain. The moonlight silvered its surface, making it shimmer like a portal. Arabella knelt before it, her body heavy with emotion. For a long moment, she said nothing. Only breathed. Then, with her eyes fixed on the broken reflection in the water, she whispered, "Why wasn't I enough?" The question hung in the air, not directed at God, nor the moon, nor even her grandmother. It was a question to the world itself, to the rigid walls that decided her worth by size, to the rituals that measured holiness by silence, to the family that traded her for piety. "I tried," she said aloud, her voice cracking. "I tried to be less. To take up less space. To stay quiet. To please them. I tried until I broke." Her voice caught. Tears slipped down her cheeks, not hot and frantic, but slow and aching, like rain after drought. "I was told this was mercy. That this place would save me." Her hand trembled as she placed it on her heart. "But I don't feel saved. I feel erased." She leaned against the cold stone rim of the basin and let the silence wash over her. Then, faintly, behind her, footsteps. Arabella turned sharply, startled. But it was only Sister Miriam. She said nothing, only approached and sat beside her on the stone bench. They sat in silence for a while, two women beneath the same moon, no longer strangers. Then Miriam spoke softly, "Not everything broken needs mending. Some things need to be seen as they are." Arabella didn't reply. But she wept, openly now, and this time, Sister Miriam didn't leave. She stayed. It began with a door left ajar. Arabella had risen early, earlier than even Father Benedict or Sister Miriam, and while fetching water from the courtyard well, she noticed the side gate hanging slightly open. The old iron latch, usually secured with precision, swayed loosely against the wood. Perhaps it had rusted. Perhaps a storm had nudged it loose. Or perhaps, though she dared not believe it, it was an invitation. For several long minutes, she stood frozen. Beyond that door lay the outer grounds, the abandoned gardens, and the edge of the woods that surrounded the chapel like a wall of green silence. It wasn't exactly freedom, but it wasn't confinement either. Her heart pounded in her chest. She should report it. That was the proper thing to do. But instead, she stepped through. The world met her with sudden, chaotic life. Sunlight filtered through leaves in mottled patterns, dusted with gold. Wind danced through the high grass, whispering secrets to the trees. And the birds, she hadn't realized how many there were. Their songs felt like a choir without constraint, raw and jubilant and untrained. Arabella inhaled sharply, almost afraid to breathe too deeply, as though the air might vanish if she acknowledged it too much. She wandered slowly, her slippers damp with dew. She touched the bark of a birch tree, pressed her palms into moss. Every texture felt like something sacred. For the first time in weeks, perhaps months, she was not surrounded by stone or scripture or judgment. She was alone, yes, but not lonely. The earth did not ask her to shrink. She found a patch of wild chamomile and sat beside it, her skirts pooling like a pale flower. Her hands instinctively reached for the blossoms. Her grandmother would have scolded her for such childish idleness, but Arabella found herself smiling. When she closed her eyes, the breeze brushed her cheeks like a caress, not a correction. She imagined herself, not as a disgrace, but as a creature belonging to this world. Round, warm, rooted. Not less. Simply different. Time slipped past unnoticed. It was the sound of her name, soft, unsure, that brought her back. Arabella? She turned. Sister Miriam stood at the edge of the garden, her brow furrowed not with anger, but worry. "I'm sorry," Arabella said quickly, standing. "I didn't mean to." Miriam raised a hand, gently. "I'm not here to scold you. Only, come back before the priest notices. For your sake." Arabella nodded, heart sinking slightly. The world behind the gate was temporary. But still, it had been hers, if only for a breath. As she stepped through the gate once more and closed it behind her, she touched the latch. Not in regret, but in quiet promise. The chapel was dimly lit when Arabella returned, the air inside strangely cooler, more silent, than it had been just an hour before. She could still smell the outdoors on her clothes, damp soil, wild mint, the sweet rot of fallen apples. But inside, the world resumed its solemn stillness. Her body obeyed the rituals. Her spirit did not. She resumed her chores without speaking. Dusting, sweeping, preparing the altar linens. She didn't notice Sister Miriam watching her until much later, when they crossed paths at the font, both reaching for the same brass basin. Their hands touched. Miriam withdrew first. Then said softly, "You've changed." Arabella looked at her, startled. "Have I?" "There's color in your cheeks. A different rhythm in your step." Miriam tilted her head. "The garden did that?" Arabella felt the flush creep up her neck. "I wasn't going to run away." "I know." Miriam smiled faintly. "But part of you did. For a moment, at least." Arabella hesitated. She should have offered an apology, maybe a confession. But what slipped from her instead was the truth. "It felt like the first time I've truly breathed since before I was brought here." That stopped Miriam. For a long moment, she didn't speak. Then she gestured to a bench near the choir loft. "Sit with me?" They sat in the hush, their skirts brushing, candles flickering in the corners like listening spirits. Arabella didn't expect anything more, but then Miriam did something unexpected. She unpinned her veil. The auburn curls spilled over her shoulders, messy, warm, human. A gesture of rebellion, however small. "I didn't come here out of faith," Miriam confessed, her voice barely audible. "I came because my father betrothed me to a man twice my age. And I said no." Arabella stared. "But you're a nun," Miriam finished. "Eventually. But not when I arrived. I came for sanctuary. And then, I stayed." She looked at Arabella, her eyes raw. "Not every woman who kneels at this altar was sent by God. Some of us were just sent." Arabella felt something in her shift. Recognition. Solidarity. Grief. They had both been offered as sacrifices, gift wrapped in the language of virtue and duty. "I used to think," Arabella whispered, "that being here was my punishment. But now, I think it was theirs. My family. They couldn't understand me. So they gave me away." Miriam reached over, her hand resting lightly on Arabella's. Not a gesture of piety, but of kinship. "You're not alone," she said. It wasn't a sermon. It was salvation. For the rest of that day, the chapel no longer felt quite so cold. There was still ritual, still silence. But within it, Arabella felt the quiet warmth of another soul walking beside her. Two women not saved by faith, but surviving within it. Their stories stitched together by choice, not chains. And in that fragile thread of friendship, something new was born. Not escape, but strength. The next morning dawned clear and cold, a silver breath across the chapel stones. Arabella rose before the bell. Her fingers, now roughened with weeks of labor, moved instinctively as she lit the altar candles and laid out the vestments. She no longer fumbled. The tasks had become muscle memory, repetition carved into her like scripture. Yet today, something felt different. The silence was not empty. It buzzed, soft and urgent, like a secret waiting to be found. She slipped out into the courtyard after breakfast, unspoken permission shared between her and Sister Miriam. No words were needed. A glance. A nod. A gate left unlatched once more. The garden had changed overnight. A single bird, sleek, black, with a russet belly, sat perched on the basin's edge, dipping its beak into the moss-dark water. Arabella froze. It was the first living thing she had seen here, besides humans. The first creature not bound by walls. The bird flitted to a low branch, then higher. Its wings spread, elegant, effortless. And just as suddenly, it was gone, slicing the air as it vanished into the morning light. Arabella stood there for several long moments, breathless. It meant nothing. Or it meant everything. She knelt beside the basin again, her palms resting against the cold stone, and whispered, "Was that a sign?" Of course, there was no reply. No voice from the sky. But within her, something stirred. Not an answer, only a knowing. The kind that builds in your chest before you even realize what you're choosing. She had come here as a burden. She had knelt at this basin, wept beside it, cursed her reflection in it. But today, she looked down and saw a woman kneeling, not broken, not punished, but present. And alive. Back in the chapel, Sister Miriam was preparing candles for Sunday vigil. She glanced up as Arabella entered, eyes widening slightly. "You're glowing," she said. "What happened?" "I saw a bird," Arabella replied, breathless. "It left." Miriam smiled, confused. "And?" "I stayed." The simplicity of the words made them powerful. Later that day, Arabella joined Miriam in sorting herbs in the storage cellar, dried lavender, mint, chamomile, and the rougher roots for poultices. As they worked, Miriam paused and said, "You know, you have a healer's touch. I've seen it. In the way you hold the stems. The way you listen." Arabella blinked. "I don't know anything about healing." "You'll learn." "You already are." Arabella didn't reply. But her hands moved with more certainty after that. She had never imagined herself as capable, not until someone gave her a name beyond disgrace. Not until someone called her something good. She went to bed that night with dirt under her fingernails and purpose blooming in her chest. The shadows still lingered, yes. But now, they were not the only thing within her. Now there was also light. Arabella no longer marked the days by mass or mealtimes. She measured them by the way the light slanted through the nave windows, by the progress of herb bundles drying above the hearth, and by the whispered conversations she shared with Sister Miriam after Compline, when the chapel was still and the air heavy with candle smoke and memory. It had been weeks since the morning she saw the bird. Yet something of that moment had stayed with her, its freedom, its stillness before flight, the fact that it had not waited for permission. And neither had she. Her strength had returned slowly, like a limb recovering from frostbite. She no longer staggered beneath the weight of a filled basin. Her hands had calloused in the right places, thumbs hardened from kneading salves, forearms firm from lifting logs and water jugs. Even the corset she'd once worn daily now hung unused on a wooden peg. She had not tightened it in weeks. When Sister Miriam offered her a small task, to mix a poultice for a visiting parishioner's bruised ribs, Arabella did it with trembling hands. But she did it. When she handed it off and the man thanked her, she felt a flicker of pride deep in her belly. "You've a gift," Miriam said softly afterward. "Not just your hands. Your heart knows how to listen." Arabella looked away, embarrassed. "I don't know about all that." "You don't have to," Miriam replied. The work will teach you. Later that week, Father Benedict approached her in the cloister garden where she was weeding beside the thyme and rue. He said nothing at first, simply watched. Then, after a pause, "You remind me of someone I once knew." Arabella waited. "She was sent here, like you. Not for faith, but for failure." Or so she thought. He looked out at the sunlit stones, voice distant. "But she stayed. She made this place better. She made me better." "Did she ever want to leave?" Arabella asked. "Every day. Until she realized that staying could be an act of power. Not submission." He left her with that. And the silence that followed wasn't cruel. It was reflective. Arabella worked until her dress was streaked with earth and her cheeks glowed from the sun. And when she finally sat down beside the basil plot, she found herself smiling. Not because the chapel had changed, but because she had. At supper, she helped Miriam serve the broth, steadying the bowls as older parishioners reached out with trembling hands. No one looked at her with pity anymore. Some nodded in thanks. A few even smiled. It wasn't adoration. It was recognition. Arabella had always believed her worth would be measured by beauty, by obedience, by the approval of the rigid world her grandmother belonged to. But now, worth meant something different. It meant usefulness, kindness, presence. And that quiet, daily choice, to stay, to heal, to grow, was beginning to feel like a rebellion all its own. The chapel bells rang at dawn, a low, solemn chime that stirred the valley air. Arabella no longer jumped at the sound. She moved with quiet confidence now, her shoulders broad with effort, her steps firm with purpose. She carried water from the well without struggle. Her hands knew each herb in the garden by scent and shape. She no longer asked what she was doing here. She belonged here. But it wasn't because she had submitted. It was because she had claimed it. That morning, a child arrived at the gates, Caroline, a local girl with a nasty scrape along her thigh. Her mother had brought her, flustered and desperate, calling for Father Benedict. But it was Arabella who stepped forward. Without waiting for approval, she ushered the girl into the infirmary chamber and knelt beside her. The little girl flinched, eyes wide. "Will it hurt?" Arabella smiled softly, washing the wound with steady fingers. "Only for a moment. Then it gets better. I promise." The girl nodded. Later, after Caroline had left, bandaged and full of honeyed tea, Sister Miriam stood watching Arabella in the herb drying room. "You led," she said, folding her arms. "You didn't wait for instruction." Arabella turned to her, brow creased. "Should I have?" No, Miriam's smile was like spring breaking through late snow. "That's how you know you've stopped surviving. And started living." It hit her then. She hadn't just adapted. She'd transformed. When Grandmother Eleanor had delivered her into this place, it had been a sentence, a sanctified exile. But Arabella had turned stone into sanctuary. Shame into strength. Obedience into selfhood. She found herself near the chapel doors that afternoon, staring at the same threshold she'd crossed months ago. They loomed tall and ancient, but now they no longer frightened her. She no longer needed them to open or close. She no longer feared who waited behind them. She had passed through something far deeper than any doorway. Father Benedict approached quietly, holding an envelope. "A letter," he said. "From your grandmother." Arabella accepted it. Her name was scrawled across the parchment in sharp, elegant script. She didn't open it. "I thought you'd want it," the priest said, turning to go. Arabella looked down at the sealed flap, then to the fire beside the altar. She stepped forward, held the envelope just above the flame, and let it go. It caught with a hiss, curling inward on itself like a dying lie. Father Benedict said nothing. But Miriam, standing near the organ, began to hum, low and steady. Arabella turned back toward the light, the gardens, the sky. She was no longer the girl who had been handed over. She was no longer even Arabella Worthington, the nobleman's shame. She was a woman forged by silence and sweat, baptized by dust and herb oil, and named by no one but herself. She stepped forward, not out of the chapel, but into her life.